The last bell of the cathedral faded into the cold of the evening, and silence collected in the corners of the bridal suite like dust the staff had missed. Naya Delacroix sat among silk petals spilled across a floor that had been polished to mirror the chandeliers. The gown that had once felt like a promise now pressed on her ribs like armor after a battle already lost. She watched the curtains breathe with the draft from the old windows and felt the ache of a story that had slipped out of her hands. Everyone had told her that the first night was a sail into a new sea. Alone in the hush, she studied a horizon that did not move. Moonlight sketched the gardens in silver lines and turned the fountain to a pale bowl without sound. The champagne flutes on the side table held a soft amber that no one would taste. The cake was somewhere on a cart downstairs, and its sugar flowers were unbruised and pointless. The veil she had once practiced lifting lay over the back of a chair like thin frost. A lifetime of prepared gestures had nowhere to land. She could list the names of every flower in her bouquet, and none of them could explain the door that had closed, with a message sent through a maid and a phrase about business. Her grandmother's diamonds lay cool against the hollow of her throat. The older woman had worn them on a day when the banks were unkind and still managed to keep the bakery open. Naya had learned inventory before she learned algebra and knew what it cost to smile when numbers did not agree with hope. She had convinced herself that Rowan Whitford's distance was the tax of a life lived near significant decisions. Power does not always arrive with courtesy, she had told her reflection, while fastening the clasp of the necklace. In the mirror now, she saw a woman who knew the cost of waiting, and finally knew that the price would not be paid again. The room was beautiful in a way that asked to be forgiven for its beauty. Marble that remembered older weather. A bed carved by hands long gone. Drapes heavy as winter fog. She moved through it with a ritual slowness as if acting out a liturgy that had been broken. She touched the spine of the grandfather clock and felt its patient heartbeat under the wood. She gathered the bouquet from the dressing table and found the first brown edge on the white orchids. African violets set among them held their color like minor planets refusing eclipse. She pressed a violet between her palms until its scent rose like a last kindness, and then set it down. The message had reached her an hour after the final toast. Lily had carried it with careful steps and eyes that did not know where to rest. Early departure, urgent business. He will return soon. Each word was without weight, yet together they pinned her to the chair until the hallway sounds thinned and the corridor lights clicked into their dusk setting. She replayed the months that had led to this night and found the holes she had named as necessary mysteries. Calls that did not end when promised, invitations accepted and then revised, apologies that sounded polished enough to pass for sincerity. She had been generous with grace and had mistaken that generosity for wisdom. She stood and unfastened the buttons of the gown with steady fingers. Each small pearl slipped free and fell against her skin like a counting prayer. She folded the fabric and placed it on the ottoman with the respect one gives to uniforms retired after a campaign. The weight left her shoulders, and with it went a longing that had begged to be believed. She washed her face, and the mirror gave her back a woman with eyes that had kept a ledger and now balanced it. She opened the wardrobe and chose a simple silk robe, the color of moss after rain, and tied it with a knot that knew it would hold. At the window, she looked down at paths that braided through hedges clipped into patient shapes. There were lights in the staff wing and movement in the kitchens where someone was packaging leftovers for the morning shifts. Farther out, the lake kept dark, and the small pier held a boat she would never use tonight. In the glass, her reflection stood beside the night like a twin that had learned to be silent. She tested a name with her mouth and felt it stiffen like a new shoe. The name married her to a house and a future, and yet she walked like a stranger at her side. Her phone lay on the table face down as if it too had chosen not to look at her. She did not reach for it. She walked instead to the pair of flutes and lifted one to the light. Bubbles had long since surrendered, and the surface was calm as waiting water. She raised the glass as though someone stood opposite, touched its rim to the air, and drank. The taste was obedient and empty. She set the flute down and felt the quiet inside her deepen into shape. It was not a collapse. The settling of a foundation had been poured while no one watched. The clock told its truth and reached past midnight with a voice that refused to apologize. She lay on the bed without turning back the covers and kept her eyes open as the ceiling read to her in the plaster seams and shadow script. The human heart likes a story with a late entrance and a reversal. She gave the heart an answer it did not want and listened to the sound that answer made as it found a home in her ribs. A cluster of childhood memories arrived without invitation. The smell of yeast at dawn when her mother proofed dough. The ache of shoes that were too small was worn one more month for the sake of the ledger. The lesson is that a door that does not open must be walked past rather than prayed at. When the wind pushed the window frame and creaked, she remembered the first time Rowan had looked at her as though she were an equation he intended to solve. She had mistaken attention for regard and proficiency for respect. She had offered her earned steadiness to a man who had been brought up to believe steadiness is furniture. She felt the sting of that mistake and thought it lessened as if a bandage had been removed and skin was allowed to breathe. The shame was not hers to carry. She stacked it neatly and set it with the gown. A fox cried once somewhere, and the sound lifted a fear thread. She followed it to its end and found only the simple truth of a long house with many rooms and only one person awake and unafraid. The staff had retreated behind their own doors. The guests who lingered after the festivities had found their beds washed in gentler lamplight. No one would come to check on the bride. She walked the corridor barefoot and let the chill of the stone wake her with each step. In the study at the corner, she touched the spines of ledgers waiting for the week to resume, and felt a pulse under paper that spoke a language she knew. She returned to the room when the sky admitted the thinnest strip of gray, and she opened the balcony doors to let the air find her. The roses below were ghosts until color returned to them. The fountain became a voice again. The horizon lifted its curtain by degrees. She could measure the distance between who had entered this room and who now stood at its edge. And the measurement was clean and exact. It did not ask her to be cruel. It did not require spectacles. It only needed her to say yes to the self that had slept under the ceremony and was now awake. She placed the bouquet in the sink and ran water until the stems drank. She took the ring off her finger, set it on the dressing table, and listened to the small ring of metal on wood that no one else would hear. She reached for the notebook she kept for everything essential and wrote dates, times, and a single sentence that would become a day of work. The sentence was not about leaving, it was about arrival. She did not yet know all that would arise from this night, but she knew the first act would be clarity, and that clarity would be visible to anyone who chose to see. She folded a shawl over her shoulders, sat in the chair by the window, and watched the lake show its first actual color. The sun finally placed a hand on the far hill, and the mountain agreed to be green again. Birds wrote small paragraphs in the shrubs near the balustrade. A cart rattled somewhere in the service lane, and the sound felt honest. A woman in a neat uniform crossed the path and glanced up, and Naya lifted a hand to her and received a slight, respectful nod in return. The nod did not pity. It recognized. The last of the night slid away and left marks that would be useful. She stood and made the bed smooth, gathered the dress and veil, carried them to the wardrobe, and gave them the space of a ceremonial rest. She tied back her hair and chose the emerald dress she had packed for a brunch that would not be needed. She stepped into it and felt her spine lift, as if the fabric remembered the line of a woman she had been before this house, and decided to return it to her. She put on the diamonds, not as an adornment, but as a banner. She brushed her cheeks with color that looked like energy rather than disguise. In the mirror, she studied a face that had spent a long night learning its landscape. The mouth belonged to someone who would say what needed to be said once, and then act. The eyes had lost a sweetness that had been borrowed, and replaced with a steadiness that had been earned. She placed her notebook on the table where it could be seen, placing beside it where it could be seen, and put the untouched flute near the bouquet where it could be seen. She set the room like a thesis. When the clock reached the hour that woke the house, She opened the door and let the corridor's light touch her shoes. She walked without hurry. The stairs took her in a rhythm she chose. She did not plan a scene, she planned a day. Somewhere, Rowan occupied a schedule that excluded ceremony and believed that urgency was a sufficient excuse. She did not choose to instruct him, she decided to lead herself. The first step was simple and stern. Breakfast, ledgers, names, costs, a map. She took the step. Behind her, the suite breathed like a theater after the curtain falls and before applause begins. No applause would come. That too was useful. The first hour of a sovereign is quiet. Naya Delacroix crossed that hour and the next and entered the morning with a posture that did not ask for witnesses. She passed a vase and set a fallen petal on its rim. She passed a maid and remembered her name. She passed a portrait of a Whitford who had built the south wing and thought of beams, weather, and time. She thought of work that would last. She thought of a crown that would not be visible but still be heavy and entirely hers. The morning rose without sleep and carried the sharp clarity of glass. Naya Delacroix stepped away from the wardrobe where her gown rested, folded like a relic, and drew the emerald dress over her shoulders. Its color caught the thin sunlight and declared a choice more potent than any spoken word. She tied her hair back, slid her grandmother's diamonds into place, and studied her reflection until she saw not the remnants of a bride, but the outline of someone who had already shifted into command. The mirror gave her a face without apology. She whispered a greeting to the woman, but it showed, "You will not be pitied." A knock came at precisely 7:30. Lily entered with the silver tray balanced between unsteady arms. Steam rose from the coffee and the crystal glass of orange juice shivered in the girl's trembling grip. Her eyes darted to the bed, still made, the gown folded, the absence of where a husband should have been. The message left on her tongue was practiced but weak. Mr. Whitford left early for urgent business. He sends word he will return soon. Naya accepted the tray with gracious steadiness and asked the girl her name. When Lily told her, Naya fixed it in memory like a detail on a ledger. Then she smiled with a curve sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell anyone who asks that I received his message with perfect understanding." The maid exhaled in relief and fled. Perfect understanding indeed. The marble steps echoed under her heels as she descended into a hall full of watchers. Staff lingered behind their dusting cloths. A gardener pretended to adjust the vase of lilies. Curiosity was thick as fog. They wanted to see whether the bride was crushed or composed. She gave them a queen's carriage, each footfall exact, shoulders set as though coronation had already occurred. The whispering thinned as she passed. The eyes that had prepared pity now shifted into appraisal. The breakfast room waited like a theater set. Evelyn Whitford sat at the head, her silver hair as disciplined as her reputation. Rowan's younger sister, Iris, pushed hollandaise across her plate with distracted shame. Two cousins sat at the far end, murmurs dying as Naya entered. The hush that followed was heavy with unsaid questions. Naya crossed the room with unhurried grace, seated herself at Evelyn's right hand, and lifted the silver tongs to serve herself fruit. "Good morning, family." Her voice carried like the strike of a bell. Polite, resonant, unbreakable. No one answered at first. The clink of cutlery became the only sound. At last, Iris whispered if she had slept well. Naya's fork cut the melon with surgical precision. "If you mean my husband and I enjoyed our wedding night, then no, Iris, we did not." Color drained from the younger woman's face. One cousin attempted diplomacy by insisting Rowan must have had compelling reasons. "Indeed, Edmund," Naya replied evenly. "It is so persuasive that you may ask him yourself when he returns." Silence poured through the room like cold water. Evelyn's fork paused in mid-air, her blue eyes sharpening with calculation. Naya continued her meal without tremor. Before stepping into the emerald dress, she decided she would not invent excuses or beg for sympathy. She would not allow her silence to be written by others, she would write her own. The staff, standing near the door, absorbed every syllable. Pity was not what they carried away from that table. They carried recognition that the mistress of the house was no victim. "You should rest this morning," suggested Evelyn finally, tone clipped but carefully courteous. "The wedding must have been exhausting." Naya's laughter rang clear and startling. "Rest, how thoughtful of you, but I find myself remarkably energized. I thought I might review the household accounts today to better understand how the estate operates." The statement fell like a gauntlet. For decades, those ledgers had been Evelyn's fortress. Her fingers tightened around her knife. "They are pretty complex," she replied, every syllable deliberate. "Perhaps, after you have settled in," Naya lifted her eyes, dark and steady. "I graduated in business administration from Georgetown and managed my family's investments for 5 years. I can handle complexity." Iris's eyes widened with something like admiration. The cousins froze in fascination, as if watching an unfamiliar game where the rules were suddenly rewritten. Evelyn set down her utensils, smiled a smile that cost her dearly, and said, "Very well. I will have the ledgers sent to your study after breakfast." The table exhaled. The battle had ended, and everyone knew who had won. Naya finished her coffee with measured calm. She did not rush, did not look for allies, or falter. She let the silence teach the room the new balance of power. No one doubted what had been established by the time plates were cleared. She was no longer the bride abandoned. She was the woman who would sit at the head of her own life, and treat absence not as loss but as license. When Iris lingered afterward, cheeks flushed with the earnest courage of youth, she spoke quietly. "Naya, I admire how you handled all of that. I could not have been so composed." Naya took her hand and told the truth she had hammered into herself during the long night. Grace is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to let pain define you. Iris nodded with damp eyes and left. Alone again, Naya looked out at the sun spilling across the gardens. The emerald fabric shone like armor. The day was only beginning, and with it, a war of dignity and dominion she had already chosen to fight. The estate was a body, and Naya began to study its circulation. Each corridor carried rhythms of movement she charted in her mind as she walked, with her notebook pressed against her palm. She observed how trays of food traveled from kitchen to dining room, how linens cycled from laundry to chambers, how orders traveled from Evelyn's pen down to the newest maid. She listened to the language of sighs behind doors and recognized where resentment had hardened into habit. By the end of the first week, she could have drawn a map that showed not only rooms but arteries of waste and nerves of discontent. She began with the ledgers. Delivered with a flourish of resistance by Evelyn's steward, the heavy books bore neat columns disguising hidden decay. Naya spread them across her study table at dawn, a mug of strong coffee beside her, and read until her eyes carried the shimmer of numbers. She discovered duplicate contracts funneling funds to vendors delivering half their worth. She found padded orders for supplies that rotted before use. She saw repairs charged twice, insurance miscalculated, and stipends granted on whims rather than policy. Where Evelyn saw complexity, Naya saw inefficiency. By the end of the day, she had marked 36 items, bleeding the household into weakness. But she did not announce discoveries as accusations. She spoke in the language of improvement. She told the steward that we were paying for linen twice. One contract may suffice. To the gardener, she said, if we plant drought-resistant hedges here, the water bill decreases by 1/5. To the kitchen staff, she suggested rotating deliveries so no vegetables wilt before service. Each correction was framed as a partnership, and each partnership returned loyalty. Where Evelyn ruled through control, Naya built power through trust. The staff began to seek her advice even before problems hardened into a crisis. She walked through the pantry one afternoon and noted its disorder. Shelves sagged with goods ordered without a plan. Dust lay thick on spices seldom used. She asked Anna, the housekeeper, what system existed, and Anna shrugged, long accustomed to chaos. That night, Naya designed a flowchart of inventory rotation, labeling which items belonged in which tiers and how to log each removal. She patiently explained it to Anna and drew symbols the illiterate staff could use. The pantry gleamed with clarity within a week, and wastage fell by half. Anna's daughter sent her a letter at school thanking the new mistress for giving her mother dignity. Naya folded the letter and placed it in her notebook, a talisman of purpose. She moved next to wages. The cooks received less than the gardeners, though their hours stretched longer. Guards rotated without sufficient rest. Stable hands were expected to sleep in barns, even in winter. Naya restructured schedules and adjusted salaries in a way that balanced both fairness and efficiency. She introduced small bonuses linked to performance that encouraged pride without breeding rivalry. She explained every change in open meetings, standing where all could see her and answering questions calmly. The staff left those gatherings with more coin and a sense of being counted as part of the house's strength. Her influence rippled outward. At the village, she sponsored scholarships for apprentices in engineering and design, drawing from her knowledge of finance to argue for investment in youth. Merchants soon preferred her contracts for their fairness and prompt payment. Even those who once whispered of the bride left alone began to speak of the lady who paid her debts on time and looked you in the eye. Respect traveled faster than gossip, and her name carried weight beyond the gates by spring. When Evelyn tried reasserting dominance by criticizing these reforms at dinner, Naya answered with data. Waste has dropped 27% since January. Staff turnover has ceased. Supplier contracts now save us $40,000 yearly. Results speak louder than tradition. The table nodded in reluctant agreement. Evelyn's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. Authority was shifting, not by rebellion, but by measurable success. Naya did not gloat. She continued to build. She also carried on quiet battles for individuals. When Anna confided that a lack of references had blocked her daughter's application to engineering school, Naya wrote letters to 2 professors she knew from Georgetown and secured the girl an interview. When a gardener's father fell ill and hospital bills threatened to drown the family, Naya arranged a medical fund through savings created by her new contracts. These gestures were not charity, but investments in loyalty. The household became a community bound not by fear, but by gratitude. Every smile she passed in the halls strengthened her more than any applause could. Late at night, she sometimes returned to the suite where her wedding dress still rested in its box. She would touch the fabric with fingers that no longer trembled and feel nothing but the weight of history already surpassed. The silence that had broken her that first night now felt like a forge. Out of it, she had crafted systems, dignity, alliances. Rowan's absence had opened a void, and she had filled it with substance. He might have claimed leadership through inheritance, but she earned it through competence. Spring carried the scent of roses into the halls, and with it came the realization that the house was no longer his in practice. It was hers. She had taken it, not by decree but by pulse. She had learned its rhythms, corrected its faults, and given it a heart that beat with her own steadiness. The Whitford estate had ceased to be a monument to wealth and had become a living body breathing under her care. She stood one evening on the balcony overlooking the lake, watching lanterns glow in staff quarters, and understood the truth. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. The Rosewood Charity Gala had always been a spectacle of jewels, whispered alliances, and silent rivalries dressed in silk. That evening, the chandeliers burned with brilliance, making the ballroom a glass and gold theater. Guests drifted through the doors in waves of perfume and ambition, their laughter calculated, their glances edged with strategy. The city's elite had gathered to fund scholarships and measure who stood at the center of influence. For weeks, the committee had whispered that Naya Whitford would make her first public appearance as the lady of the estate. Curiosity had sharpened its knives. She arrived hurriedly, emerald silk falling in clean lines from shoulder to heel, diamonds catching the light with every turn of her head. Her entrance was a study in command. The orchestra faltered a note, conversations bent, and eyes pulled toward her as if gravity had shifted. She walked the crimson carpet as though it had been laid in acknowledgement rather than welcome. The women adjusted their smiles, and the men adjusted their postures, each reminded of what presence looked like when clothed in poise. Whispers flowered among the clusters of tuxedos and gowns. Some wondered if she would appear subdued, still wounded by the wedding night humiliation. Instead, they saw a woman who carried herself as though the crown of the evening already rested on her brow. When she paused to greet Judge Everett Cole with a clasp of both hands, he bowed slightly, his voice warm with respect. When she accepted a flute of champagne from a waiter, she did so with the air of blessing rather than consumption. Every gesture was precise, deliberate, unmistakable. The hum of speculation swelled when Rowan entered the ballroom. His arrival was late enough to seem staged, and on his arm glittered Vivian Ashford, a woman sculpted in red satin, with hair swept into a cascade of polished fire. Gasps darted like sparks among the crowd. The audacity was theatrical, the insult calculated. Rowan smiled as though he carried no shame, as though the gala were his stage, and Vivian his chosen ornament. Together they walked toward the central floor, where patrons already turned their bodies in anticipation of a confrontation. Naya did not retreat. She moved forward. Each step was measured, with the heels tapping like a drumline. When she reached the circle where expectation coiled, she stood at full height and let the silence feed her power. Vivian's lips curved into a smile sharpened with cruelty. Rowan offered bland words of greeting, rehearsed as if they might pass for civility. Naya lifted her chin and addressed not them but the room, her voice carrying with clarity that silenced violins. She said he said some dance with what disappears when the lights come on. I prefer to be the light. Her words cut through the perfume haze, pure as crystal. Gasps surged, then hands began to clap. Judge Cole was the first, then the mayor, then the orchestra conductor, until the entire room applauded. Vivian's smile cracked like porcelain struck with a hammer. Rowan's composure reddened into embarrassment that no posture could conceal. Naya inclined her head with sovereign composure and turned, stranding them in a storm of recognition. The gala unfolded after that like a coronation. Donors pressed close, eager to secure her attention. Politicians quoted her line with reverence. Photographers captured her in frames that would dominate society pages by morning. She laughed with board members, strategized with educators, and encouraged young scholars with promises of opportunity. Every interaction was genuine, deliberate, and watched. By the time pledges were tallied, the scholarship fund had broken all previous records. The committee credited her presence and her poise with the triumph. The night belonged to her beyond dispute. Rowan lingered at the edges, attempting to reclaim relevance, but conversations parted around him like water around stone. Vivian tried to summon charm, but her glances slid off shoulders that no longer turned. The ballroom had redrawn its map, and neither occupied its center. Naya had not merely endured humiliation, she had converted it into fuel. The whispers that had predicted pity now told of power. She had walked into the fire and emerged not burned but luminous. When the orchestra struck the final waltz, Naya accepted a dance from a senator twice her age, who held her hand as though it were a relic of dignity. Around them, the room spun with awe. Her emerald dress flared like a standard lifted in victory as she turned beneath the chandeliers. She met Rowan's gaze once across the floor. There was no malice in her eyes, only the calm certainty of someone who had measured his absence and found it irrelevant. He looked away first. The music swelled, and the night sealed itself into history. The story was already written by the last carriage that rolled into the night. Naya Delacroix Whitford was no longer the abandoned bride. She was the woman who had stood in a room of predators and predators in training and chosen to be the light. The city would not forget it. Neither would Rowan. Neither would she. The weeks after the Rosewood Gala unfolded like the echo of a bell that refused to fade. Naya's words had traveled farther than she imagined. Newspapers printed her photograph above headlines that praised her clarity and composure. Commentators on morning programs dissected her statement about light, calling it a leadership philosophy. Invitations multiplied, first from neighbors and then from governors, judges, and civic leaders who had once overlooked her. By the end of spring, her calendar held more engagements than Rowan's ever had. Catherine Cole, wife of Judge Everett Cole, extended the first significant invitation. The Cultural Arts Foundation had struggled for years with stagnant programs and dwindling endowments. At a luncheon, Catherine took Naya's hand across the linen-covered table and said, "The city needs your mind." Naya accepted, not out of vanity but because she recognized the lever that arts provided in shaping community pride and future vision. Her first meeting as a board member surprised the older patrons. She arrived with charts, projections, and a framework for restructuring grants to reach underrepresented artists. Where others spoke in nostalgia, she spoke in outcomes. By the close of that session, she was appointed chair of a new initiative to diversify exhibitions. Within a month, another call came. Dr. Mira Klein, head of the most extensive hospital system in the county, requested her presence at a forum on medical outreach. She wanted Naya to lead a committee examining access to healthcare in low-income neighborhoods. At the gathering, where officials presented long reports and excuses, Naya listened carefully and then asked a single question. What measurable change will this achieve in 1 year? The silence that followed revealed the absence of a strategy. She offered a data-based blueprint combining mobile clinics, scholarship pipelines for medical students, and partnerships with local businesses. The proposal turned heads and loosened purse strings. Soon, the project bore her signature. Her presence reached beyond committees. At the Community Leaders Council, a quarterly summit where politicians, educators, and entrepreneurs gathered, Naya was given a seat at the front table beside the mayor. She did not lobby for her place. The council recognized her as indispensable. She addressed the assembly on vocational training, arguing that apprenticeships in technology and skilled trades should not be framed as lesser paths, but as vital arteries of the city's growth. Her words carried the authority of one who had lived among ledgers and laborers alike. The applause was not polite but full, and the council voted unanimously to pursue her proposals. Rowan attended that summit, slipping into the room with his polished shoes and lingering arrogance. He had expected to command the stage by virtue of name and inheritance. Instead, he found himself against the wall, uninvited to the head table, watching his wife command the respect he had squandered. After Naya's speech, he approached a cluster of business people, offering his connections, but the men glanced toward her before responding. Influence had shifted. Access had been redefined. The current no longer flowed through him. Naya did not gloat. She carried herself with the same measured dignity she had cultivated since that first silent night. After the council adjourned, she was surrounded by educators requesting her input on curriculum design, nonprofit directors asking her to speak at their events, and civic leaders seeking her counsel. Rowan watched from a distance, his smile fixed but his posture faltering. For him, the gathering was a revelation. For her, it simply confirmed what she already knew. Respect is not inherited. It is earned in the visible field of service. The staff at the estate sensed the change as well. Invitations arrived daily, thick envelopes with embossed seals. Evelyn's once constant voice of control grew quieter as she realized that doors now opened not for her son, but for her daughter-in-law. Even Iris, once timid in her sister-in-law's shadow, began to look at Naya with admiration rather than pity. The cousins who whispered behind their hands now repeated her phrases at their gatherings. The family tree was reorienting its compass. The weight of responsibility did not leave Naya untouched. There were nights when she sat alone at her desk, shoulders aching, mind racing with the scale of work ahead. She read reports until her vision blurred, then walked the gardens under the moonlight to clear her thoughts. Yet in those moments, she felt a profound certainty that each decision mattered, not as an ornament to her reputation, but as a building block for a city that deserved more. Leadership was no longer an aspiration. It was a reality pressing on her each morning and each night. By early summer, she had become the axis around which the county measured itself. Her name was attached to arts, medicine, and education programs. Her presence at a gathering lent it credibility. She was sought not as a symbol, but as a strategist. Rowan's absence, once the source of shame, had transformed into the space where she built her authority. He became a shadow lingering at the edges of her growing light. The county had recalibrated its compass, and it pointed firmly toward her. Autumn arrived with sharp winds and an undercurrent of urgency in the city's business circles. Granite Harbor Industries, one of the most powerful manufacturing groups in the region, sought to expand into new territory. Their reputation carried both strength and suspicion. Damian Blackwell, the formidable head of the company, was known for ruthless negotiations that left communities drained while shareholders prospered. When whispers spread that Granite Harbor had requested a private meeting at the Whitford estate, the county's eyes turned toward Naya. She prepared without fanfare. Days before the meeting, she reviewed every report available on Granite Harbor's labor practices, environmental record, and history of corporate partnerships. She underlined violations, highlighted promises never fulfilled, and marked where small concessions had been dressed as generosity. She filled the margins of her notebook with questions sharper than any sword. To her, the meeting was not about welcoming investment at any cost, but about demanding standards that would protect workers and strengthen the community. The estate's future depended on principled engagement. The morning of the meeting, the study was arranged with deliberate care. Contracts were stacked neatly on the desk. Charts hung on the wall showing economic growth tied to educational pipelines and community reinvestment. A pot of tea steamed quietly on a side table. When Damian Blackwell arrived, tall and broad with eyes that surveyed the room like a battlefield, Naya stood to greet him. His CFO followed, briefcase in hand, already preparing counter-arguments. Naya extended her hand first. "Welcome to the Whitford estate. Let us speak plainly." Damian nodded with a trace of surprise. Few women had ever met his gaze without flinching. The conversation began with cautious formalities, but soon sharpened. Damian proposed job creation, tied loosely to tax breaks and vague commitments. Naya countered with specifics. She insisted on workforce pipelines through local universities and vocational schools. She demanded investment in community equity funds to ensure long-term benefit. She presented environmental commitments with measurable benchmarks. When Damian attempted to shift the subject toward profit margins, she redirected him with evidence and reason. The CFO scribbled notes furiously as the discussion tilted further in her favor. Damian leaned back at last and studied her with reluctant respect. At that moment, the sound of hurried heels echoed through the hall. The study doors burst open and Vivian Ashford appeared, draped in crimson silk, her expression rehearsed for drama. She swept into the room without invitation, her voice carrying false brightness. "I thought you might need a friendly face," she said to Damian, ignoring Naya as though she were furniture. Rowan trailed behind her, his smile strained, his eyes flicking nervously between the figures at the table. He had orchestrated this intrusion, convinced he could reclaim control of the meeting through spectacle. Vivian placed herself at Damian's side, leaning close, offering charm like currency. "I know the Whitford family better than anyone," she purred. "I am your best choice if you want a partner who understands influence." The air thickened with tension. Naya remained seated, unshaken. She folded her hands on the desk and looked directly at Damian. "This meeting was requested with me. If you wish to negotiate with distractions, I suggest another venue." Her tone was calm, her words precise. The insult landed squarely on Vivian and Rowan. Damian did not take Vivian's extended hand. He met Naya's eyes instead. "We are here for Mrs. Whitford's strategy." Vivian's face blanched, her composure cracking. Rowan attempted to smooth over the scene with hollow laughter, but the damage was done. Naya rose and signaled to Anna, the housekeeper, who had been waiting quietly outside. She said, "Please escort Miss Ashford back to her carriage," with unyielding courtesy. Anna obeyed with professional grace, guiding Vivian out despite her protests. Rowan followed, humiliated, leaving only the echo of their failed performance. Naya returned to the table as though nothing had happened, pouring fresh tea for Damian and his CFO. "Now about emissions standards," she said. The conversation resumed stronger than before. By the end of the day, Granite Harbor had agreed to unprecedented clauses. They would fund apprenticeships, build community childcare centers, and submit to quarterly environmental audits. Damian signed the preliminary agreement with a pen that shook slightly in his hand. He stood, clasped Naya's hand firmly and said, "I underestimated you." She smiled faintly. Many do at first. The words held no bitterness, only truth. Damien left the estate with the awareness that he had encountered a leader whose authority came not from inheritance, but from integrity. When the doors closed behind them, Naya allowed herself a moment of quiet breath. She knew the battle was not over. Corporations often promised more than they delivered, yet she had drawn boundaries that could not be easily erased. She had established herself as the guardian of the estate and as a voice for the entire community. Her influence had crossed from social respect into economic power. The county would feel the ripple for years. That night, she walked through the halls of the estate, lantern in hand, listening to the soft rhythm of the house. The staff greeted her with pride, aware of the victory. Evelyn, though silent, regarded her with eyes that no longer measured doubt but something closer to reluctant admiration. In her study, Naya placed the signed agreement beside her notebook. She traced the ink with steady fingers. It was not just paper. It was proof that action spoke louder than lineage, that markets could be bent by principles when carried with unflinching resolve. Markets speak in actions, and hers had begun to shape the future. January wrapped the estate in a frost that silenced even the fountains, and it was in that cold clarity Rowan requested his first actual audience. Word came through Evelyn, her voice carefully neutral, that her son wished to see his wife in the parlor by the east wing. Naya agreed, not out of longing, but out of discipline. A sovereign meets all supplicants, even those who once wore crowns by birthright. The fire was already lit when she entered. Rowan paced before it, his reflection trembling across the flames. He turned with a smile that sought to bridge the canyon between them, but the expression carried no weight. He began with a practiced confession. Mistakes were made. He spoke as though regret were currency that could purchase amnesty. His eyes avoided hers at crucial moments, betraying the truth that the apology was crafted not from comprehension but from desperation. Naya sat without invitation for him to continue. She folded her hands in her lap and listened as he spoke of rebuilding trust, mending what had been broken, and starting anew. His sentences carried the hollowness of memorized lines. Each phrase leaned on passive voice, as if betrayal were a natural storm rather than a choice made by a man. When he faltered, he reached for the safety of sentiment. He said, "You were always my anchor," as though naming her such might erase the memory of Vivienne's crimson gown at the gala. When he paused, waiting for her softness, she asked the question that cut the air into truth. "Specify which trust you believe you have ever earned." He blinked, lips parting without words. She did not fill the silence. Instead, she waited, her gaze steady as iron. He tried again, pivoting to promises of connections he could offer, introductions that would secure her position further. She replied evenly, "I have better." He shifted to financial support. She answered, "My teams show up every morning without fail." He reached for the final weapon, the declaration of love. She regarded him as one might study a faded document. "Love without respect curdles into convenience," she said. And convenience is not partnership. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward like fragments of his unraveling defense. He protested that he had changed, that absence had taught him the shape of his error. She rose, her shadow crossing his as she stood. "Change is not declared, Rowan. Change is evidenced. Respect is demonstrated, fidelity is daily, and partnership is proven. You come with none of these." He opened his mouth again, but no sound arrived. His arguments had collapsed under the weight of her precision. For a moment, he looked like the boy he once had been, a child raised to believe lineage excused weakness. His eyes darted as though searching for a script to follow, but none was left. She had removed them all. The silence was heavy, but not cruel. It was the silence of a verdict. He finally turned back to the fire, shoulders bent in the posture of a man who realized absence had carved his place more deeply than presence ever could. Naya left the parlor without looking back. The echo of her heels across the marble floor spoke the judgment that needed no further articulation. Behind her, Rowan remained by the hearth, smaller than the flames that licked upward with greater strength. He had come to rehearse remorse, She had demanded comprehension. He had offered performance. She had named the principle. He had lost not by rejection, but by irrelevance. That night, as she sat in her study with the ledgers of new initiatives spread before her, she wrote a single line in the margin of her notebook. Respect unproven is no respect at all. She underlined it once, then returned to her figures. The county awaited her counsel. Her staff awaited her guidance. Her life awaited her presence. Rowan's absence no longer defined her. His apology merely confirmed what she already knew. She needed no permission to lead, no sentiment to justify her crown. She had already stepped into her sovereignty and would not step back. March unfurled with a gentleness that seemed to carry spring on its shoulders, washing the estate grounds in pale sunlight and early blooms. The long winter months had hardened Naya into steel, but the promise of warmer days offered her a moment to transform steel into ceremony. The family reunion, a tradition older than many of the ancestral portraits lining the halls, was scheduled to return to the Whitmore estate. It had not gathered beneath those roofs since the night of her ill-fated wedding. After a year of fire, judgment, and rebuilding, the ballroom was readied not as a shrine to what was lost, but as a testament to what had endured. She orchestrated every detail with the precision of a conductor. The chandeliers were polished until they caught light like captured stars. The tables carried heritage dishes and daring innovations, symbolizing how family history could live alongside progress. A gallery wall displayed achievements of cousins and uncles, graduations, inventions, and charitable works, all curated under her eye to remind every attendee that legacy was built daily, not merely inherited. Her intent was clear. This was not just a dinner. It was a reckoning disguised as a celebration. By evening, the Whitmores arrived in waves, their laughter rising through the grand entrance, their coats draped across the outstretched arms of staff. Some entered with guarded curiosity, uncertain how the young bride abandoned at the altar of matrimony would present herself now. Others carried pride in whispers, already speaking of her influence in county councils, of scholarships and investments that bore her touch. Every step she took through the crowd was measured, welcoming, deliberate. She was no longer Rowan's wife. She was Naya Whitmore, the axis around which the household now spun. Marcus, barely 16 and brimming with energy, pierced the formal hush with innocence. "Aunt Naya," he called across the ballroom, "my teacher says the summer program you helped me get into is one of the best in the state. Did you really do that for me?" His mother hushed him, embarrassed, but the room had already stilled. Naya crossed to him, resting a hand on his shoulder, and spoke clearly enough for all nearby to hear. "I didn't do it for you, Marcus. You did it yourself through diligence. I only made sure the right people could see your worth." The boy's grin glowed brighter than the chandeliers, and in that moment, the unspoken truth crystallized. Her influence was no rumor. It was a thread sewn into the lives of her kin. The older generation noticed. Professor Harold approached, spectacles glinting, his voice carrying both age and respect. "My nephew tells me your education programs have transformed the county." He paused, studying her carefully. "I have spent a lifetime teaching, but I have rarely seen someone command respect with so much clarity." His words, humble yet heavy, spread through the nearby cluster. More relatives joined, each revealing they had read of her in newspapers or heard from business partners whose fortunes had been touched by her strategies. Naya, who had once been introduced as Rowan's bride, was now considered a leader independent of any man. But the evening was not free of shadow. Great-Aunt Eleonora, whose questions were sharper than winter air, asked the one that many pretended not to. "Where is Rowan tonight?" The hush returned, heavier this time. Naya did not flinch. Rowan sent his regards, and she answered smoothly. He also gave his best wishes for our family's joy. The words were diplomatic, neither lie nor truth, yet everyone present heard the emptiness behind them. A few exchanged glances, understanding well what his absence meant. No one pressed further. His irrelevance spoke louder than her courtesy. Later, as desserts filled the tables and brandy warmed the room, Evelyn approached her daughter-in-law quietly. She whispered that you have managed this gathering with a grace I could never have imagined. Tonight, you reminded this family of what it means to hold our name with dignity. Naya inclined her head, recognizing both compliment and concession. Evelyn acknowledged her publicly and signaled to all present that the mantle of matriarch was passing. The night culminated in the traditional family toast. Glasses were raised as Miriam, the eldest by marriage, declared that Naya had not merely upheld the honor of the Whitmore name, but had elevated it. Applause thundered across the ballroom. People rose from their seats, clapping a tide of affirmation that swept through Naya's chest like a crown placed without ceremony. In their eyes, she was no longer the outsider. She was the embodiment of the family's continuity. One by one, cousins approached her, speaking of daughters inspired by her programs, of sons guided by her counsel. Even the skeptical uncles, whose approval was notoriously hard-won, admitted that she had transformed the family's reputation in wider circles. They offered business partnerships, invitations to advise, and requests for mentorship of their children. Naya accepted each with gracious composure, though inside she recognized what had transpired. Tonight was not simply a reunion. It was a coronation. When the ballroom finally emptied and the echoes of laughter drifted into silence, she stood alone amid the remnants of celebration. Silver platters gleamed under candlelight, and roses lingered in the air. She thought of the night 1 year ago, when she had sat abandoned in a wedding dress that felt like a costume stitched for someone else. That woman no longer existed. In her place stood the matriarch of a dynasty reborn, not through lineage, but through merit. She moved to the tall windows, gazing across the gardens washed in moonlight. The house no longer felt cavernous or haunted by silence. It was alive with loyalty, respect, and truth. Her reflection stared back at her, adorned not with lace or jewels, but with something far more enduring: the quiet authority of a woman who had faced humiliation and turned it into sovereignty. She whispered to the night beyond the glass as the grandfather clock struck midnight. Tonight, the truth was celebrated, and the truth is that I have risen. She turned back into the ballroom, every footstep steady, every breath filled with certainty. The abandoned bride was gone forever. In her place stood the keeper of the Whitmore legacy, the living proof that once claimed and defended, truth became the strongest crown. April pressed warmth against the estate, but it did nothing to soften the ice that had settled between Naya and Rowan. The family reunion had sealed what the county already whispered in admiration. She was the matriarch in truth, if not in name. Every invitation came to her first. Every petition for advice found her desk. Every word of recognition praised her alone. Rowan's absence had been barely remarked upon, his relevance already eroded like a shoreline eaten by tide. He knew it too. His third request for a private conversation arrived Monday afternoon, while Naya reviewed internship applications for the youth development program she had founded. Evelyn entered with the message written plainly on her face: "Your husband asks for an audience in the morning room." Naya did not look up from the stack of essays before her. "Tell him I will come when I am finished here. These lives matter more." She read 3 more applications, circled notes in the margins, and only then allowed herself to walk the marble corridors toward him. He was pacing when she entered, restless, thinner than before. The tremor in his hand as he touched the mantle betrayed nights of poor sleep. When he saw her, he blurted the words he had practiced. "She is gone. Cordelia left. She said she was tired of playing second to a woman who had already won." He waited for her reaction, searching her face for shock, satisfaction, anything. There was none. "I see," Naya said, with the detachment of someone acknowledging the weather in another country. "And why do you tell me this?" "Because it means we can begin again," Rowan said quickly. "There is no more complication. We can rebuild what was broken." His eyes begged, but his words stumbled like a man walking through rubble. Naya seated herself with deliberate grace, folding her silk dress around her. "Cordelia was never the problem," she said. "She was the symptom of the issues that began long before she existed." His jaw worked uselessly, confusion and denial tightening his features. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Removing a symptom does not cure the disease," she replied. "You had already abandoned our marriage, emotionally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. Cordelia's presence only revealed it to others. Her words cut cleanly, and he flinched. Still, he pressed on, clinging to hope like a man dangling from a cliff. "Then let us rebuild trust. I will earn it." "Trust," she repeated slowly, "is not rebuilt. It is earned through consistent action over the years. It cannot be recreated when it never existed in the first place." Rowan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked older instantly, a man finally seeing what had been invisible to him for too long. "Then tell me what to do," he begged. "What must I do to regain it?" Naya rose and crossed to the tall windows. Spring flowers painted the gardens, renewal glowing beyond the glass. She turned back, her expression steady, weary, and absolute. "You are asking the wrong question, Rowan. The question is not what you must do to earn my trust. The question is, why do you think my trust is still available to be earned?" His shoulders slumped as though struck. "You are my wife," he whispered, clinging to the title as though it could anchor him. "I am your wife-in-law only," she said with devastating calm. "That is a status. It is not a relationship. A relationship requires respect, partnership, and shared purpose. Ours has none." He sank into the nearest chair, the hollow sound of collapse echoing in the room. "Then there is nothing I can do? No way to win you back?" She smiled faintly, a smile without warmth. "You never won me, Rowan. I was given to you. That woman is gone." His voice cracked. "Then who are you now?" "I am who I always should have been. A builder of businesses, a guide for communities, a leader whose presence lifts others, someone whose absence would matter." Every sentence pressed him further into his seat. He looked at her with dawning comprehension that she had become a force beyond his grasp. "I want to be part of that life," he said desperately. "I want to stand beside you." "Partnership requires contribution," she said evenly. "What would you add that I do not already provide for myself and others?" He faltered, stammering about resources, connections, and companionship. Each time she answered with evidence of what she had already achieved without him. Finally, he tried his last refuge. "What about love? What about the vow we made?" Her voice softened but held no surrender. "Love requires respect and sacrifice. Commitment is proven in actions, not titles. You have lived without both." The silence was crushing. Rowan had entered hoping for forgiveness, perhaps even reconciliation. Instead, he sat exposed, irrelevant, superfluous. She regarded him with a distant pity, not cruel, not vengeful, but final. "Your regret is not my burden, Rowan. Your presence here is tolerated for convenience only, nothing more." She returned to her study that night, the glow of lamplight falling across scholarship applications, letters of hope from children she had never met, but whose lives she intended to change. She underlined a sentence in one essay. "I want to become someone my family can rely on." She set down her pen and whispered, "Yes, that is the measure." Rowan's footsteps faded down the hall, the sound of a man dismissed, not with fury, but with indifference. He had hoped for a door to reopen. Instead, he discovered a wall of steel. And that wall was not built from anger, but from clarity, forged in betrayal, reinforced by sovereignty. Naya closed the final folder of the night, extinguished the lamp, and walked to her chamber. The garden moonlight followed her steps like a crown. The woman who had once waited in lace for a husband who never came was gone. In her place stood a sovereign with unbreakable walls, not to keep the world out, but to preserve the empire she had built within. September swept over the estate with air so crisp it seemed to sharpen every decision, every movement, every choice. Leaves burned gold at the edges, the orchards bowed under harvest, and the corridors of Whitmore Manor thrummed with preparations for something far larger than any season before. For the first time in history, the grand ballroom was not to host a wedding or a reunion, but a summit. Governors, university presidents, technology magnates, and philanthropists are all converging to discuss the creation of an innovation district that would transform the county into a beacon of opportunity. And at the center of it all was Naya, no longer an outsider or even a survivor, but the indisputable architect of progress. She moved through the preparations like a general through a campaign. Seating charts reflected alliances, catering symbolized heritage and inclusivity, and breathing packets contained economic projections and visions of social elevation. Every delegate received a dossier assembled by her team, bound in deep green leather embossed with a crest she had quietly redesigned to reflect the new era of the Whitmore legacy. Where a shield and sword once dominated the emblem, now open hands and interlocking branches spoke of growth, partnership, and resilience. She was rewriting her role and the family's identity she had been forced to inherit. On the morning of the summit, the ballroom glittered with chandeliers polished brighter than daylight. Rows of flags stood at attention, representing institutions and states that had answered her call. Naya entered last, dressed in sapphire silk, her grandmother's diamonds at her ears, her posture regal enough to silence conversation. All eyes followed her, even those who had come expecting to bend her influence toward their agendas. She did not command silence, it arrived for her. Governor Hayes began with words of recognition, declaring the initiative a model for sustainable development. Dr. Margaret Foster, president of State University, spoke of the educational impact. Executives from Blackstone Industries outlined investments measured in hundreds of millions. Each paused to acknowledge Naya's leadership, vision, and relentless pursuit of integration between business success and community uplift. She accepted each tribute with poise, never basking, constantly redirecting credit toward the collective. It was not false humility, it was a strategy. A queen's power grows not by hoarding glory, but multiplying it. Then, just as negotiations reached their height, the disturbance arrived. Raised voices in the foyer, urgent footsteps crossing marble. Naya turned her head slightly, recognizing the cadence of desperation before she even saw him. Rowan. He entered the ballroom disheveled, his tie crooked, eyes bloodshot, the mask of entitlement stripped to reveal the hollowness beneath. Conversations faltered, then fell into uneasy silence. He strode forward, ignoring the stares of governors and executives, until he stood in the center of the chamber like a storm that had wandered into a temple. Naya did not move. Her stillness was armor. "The Sarah," Rowan began, his voice loud enough to echo. "I need to say something, before everyone who matters to us." He dropped to his knees on the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the audience, some from scandal, others from second-hand embarrassment. He spoke words, rehearsed but raw. "I abandoned you. I betrayed the strongest woman I have ever known. I do not deserve forgiveness, but I beg for it here, before the eyes of all who can judge." For a moment, silence pressed down like a hand. But Naya felt no tremor in her chest. She had prepared for storms, and this was only wind. "Rowan," she said evenly, "you are correct about one thing. You abandoned someone of value, but you are mistaken in the rest. Forgiveness is not begged in public, it is earned in private, through consistent sacrifice, through evidence of change. You have shown none." Her words carried the weight of judgment, not just for him, but for all listening. "Second," she continued, "you left me when I was yours, and I rose. I did not rise despite you, but because of your absence. Your abandonment carved the space where I discovered who I was meant to be. That truth belongs to me, not to you. Third, regret is not repentance. Your kneeling here is theater. My work is reality. You cannot confuse performance with transformation. And finally," she said, her voice deepening into resonance, "a woman does not fall when abandoned. She rises. And when she rises, she lifts her family, community, and world. I have done that, and nothing you declare on your knees can unmake it." She did not shout. She did not weep. She spoke with the composure of one who had long since transcended the need to prove. The room erupted into applause, not hesitant but thunderous. Leaders rose, clapping until the sound roared like a storm tide. Governor Hayes was the first, followed by Dr. Foster, the corporate executives, and every delegate in the hall. Their ovation was for her words and what she embodied. Resilience, vision, and leadership tested under fire. Rowan remained kneeling, forgotten even as he had tried to make himself central. Some averted their eyes, others turned their backs. His humiliation was complete, but more than that, it was irrelevant. As the applause subsided, Naya returned the focus to the work. She invited the delegations to sign the final contracts. Spreading documents across the table like Rowan was no more than a draft drifting on the edges of history. Signatures flowed, pens scratching like the sound of futures being written. When the last agreement was sealed, she closed the folder and looked across the room. "What we have built here today is not mine alone," she said. "It belongs to every child who dreams of learning, to every worker who seeks dignity, to every family who deserves a future brighter than their past. That is the crown we raise together." By evening, as the delegates departed with contracts worth millions and visions worth generations, Naya stood in her study, surrounded by evidence of triumph. Letters of request from neighboring states, invitations to speak at national forums, proposals for partnerships, all flowing toward her like tributaries to a river. Evelyn entered quietly, her face illuminated with a pride she no longer attempted to hide. "My dear," she said softly, "today proved what I knew long ago. You are not only the heart of this family, you are its crown jewel." Naya touched the edge of the contracts and let the words settle. The crown was not a diadem of gold or diamonds. It was forged in fire, betrayal, and unyielding principle. It was made of competence and character, of choices repeated daily until they became destiny. The clock struck midnight, its chime steady as her heartbeat. She looked toward the gardens bathed in moonlight, then back to the ledgers, the letters, the work that awaited. She had been abandoned on her wedding night. She had been tested by scorn, challenged by humiliation, dismissed by the man who should have honored her. And yet she had risen. Not to reclaim what was lost, but to claim what she had always carried within her. The crown of triumph was hers, and it would never slip. The morning after the summit dawned quietly, but carried the hum of something irreversible. The estate corridors were still littered with traces of the night before, a forgotten silk glove near the stairs, the lingering scent of champagne, papers left stacked in orderly piles awaiting signatures from couriers. But the true aftermath was not written in crumbs of festivity. It was unfolding in the flood of correspondence that began arriving before sunrise. The first messenger delivered a sealed packet from the governor's office, requesting Naya's counsel on a forthcoming statewide initiative for renewable energy zones. Within hours, another courier arrived, bearing a letter embossed with the crest of a national university. The dean invited her to lecture before the graduating class of business students, not merely on leadership, but on the architecture of resilience. By midday, her desk was buried in invitations. Nonprofits sought her presence at galas. Chambers of commerce requested her endorsement. Editorial boards begged for opinion pieces under her signature. The world beyond the estate had confirmed what the summit had declared. Naya Whitmore was no longer a symbol of scandal, but a model of transformation. She reviewed each letter carefully, annotating with notes in her tidy script. "Yes, for the university," she wrote. "Declined the invitation to the wine merchants. Too narrow, too insular. Agree to the symposium on women in governance." She was no longer operating as someone grateful to be included. She was curating influence, selecting where her presence would multiply impact rather than scatter it. Authority had shifted from something precariously defended to something deliberately wielded. That evening, her study was filled with a small circle of advisors she had cultivated from among the staff and community leaders. Dr. Helena Park, a scholar in organizational psychology, spread charts across the oak table, showing the ripple effects of the summit agreements. Apprenticeship enrollments had surged, applications for small business grants doubled overnight. Teachers reported students repeating Naya's words in classrooms. Even Evelyn attended the session, no longer as a skeptic but as a participant. She poured tea with hands steadier than ever, her silence carrying not disapproval but deference. Governor Lila Patterson's call arrived during the meeting, her voice warm with conviction. "We would like to adapt your framework statewide," she said. "Can we count on your guidance?" Naya listened, considered, and then answered with measured clarity. "I will not allow replication without integrity. To do this, it must protect the smallest voices as fiercely as it amplifies the loudest. The governor agreed without hesitation, indicating how firmly the tide had turned. The estate staff mirrored that tide. No longer did they glance toward Evelyn for permission or Rowan for approval. Their loyalty and respect flowed directly toward Naya, evident in how they carried themselves through the halls. When she passed, they lifted their chins higher. When she asked after their families, they answered not with caution but with pride. The house felt lighter, as though walls once strained under secrecy and tension now breathed with freedom. Rowan lingered on the fringes, his presence tolerated like the echo of a song long since ended. He no longer attempted grand gestures or public spectacles. He drifted through the estate like a man stripped of script, unable to find lines that mattered. At times, Naya caught him watching her in gatherings, eyes hollow with the recognition that his story had slipped from center stage. She offered him no cruelty, only the absence of acknowledgement. To her, he was not an enemy but an irrelevance. As weeks turned into months, Naya's influence deepened. Judge Everett Cole requested copies of her conflict resolution scripts in his courtroom. Dr. Helena Park drafted a proposal for Naya to co-author a book on the psychology of leadership forged through trial. International delegations began to inquire about visiting the county to observe the Innovation District. Each request was an opportunity and a responsibility, and Naya patiently met them all. One afternoon, Evelyn approached her in the garden, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. Evelyn had ruled with iron composure for decades, seldom yielding words of affection. But now she set the tray down and sat beside Naya on the stone bench, the roses climbing behind them. She said, "You are not simply in this family," her voice uncharacteristically soft. "You are the reason it is better." Naya looked at her, recognizing the depth of concession those words carried. She inclined her head once, neither proud nor dismissive, but acknowledging the truth that no longer needed to be debated. In the stillness of that moment, she understood that legacy was not measured by the ceremonies of weddings or the weight of jewels. It was estimated in invitations, calls for guidance, and respect earned through unyielding action. The aftermath of betrayal had become the foundation of authority. The humiliation she once endured had been transfigured into an influence that others sought, recorded, and celebrated. As dusk settled over the estate, she stood at her study window again, the letters of request stacked neatly, the progress charts spread across her desk. The lamps glowed golden, and the staff's quarters flickered with laughter and music beyond the glass. She touched the edge of a letter from an international institute inviting her to keynote their global conference. A crown forged not in gold, but in trust rested invisibly upon her head. The world had measured her aftermath, and found in it not ruin but renaissance. Winter returned with softer winds than the year before, brushing frost along the balustrades of Whitmore Estate and layering the gardens in silver dust. The season no longer carried the sting of abandonment. Instead, it arrived as a backdrop against which triumph could be measured, quiet and steady. The house, once a stage for humiliation, now pulsed with the rhythm of transformation. Every corridor carried echoes of loyalty. Every chamber bore witness to progress. Naya moved through it as one who knew not only that she belonged, but that she had remade its very foundation. The scholarship pipeline she had envisioned had widened into a flowing river. Dozens of young men and women, who might never have dreamed beyond the limits of their village, now held acceptance letters from universities, their futures unrolling like banners of possibility. The apprenticeship program with Granite Harbor was no longer a promise but a daily reality, its factory humming with new workers trained under conditions of fairness and dignity. Community childcare centers, once only lines in a contract, now rang with the laughter of children whose parents could labor without fear. The proof of her leadership was not in speeches but in structures, not in applause but in the lives changed. Each morning, she walked her study before the day began, reviewing the ledgers that no longer bled but thrived. Profit sharing had matured into a program envied across the region, binding worker loyalty with prosperity. Investments multiplied not by chance but strategy. Each decision weighted against her guiding principle: growth must be shared to be sustainable. The numbers told a story of stability, but what they represented was far greater: a community rising with her. She kept on her desk a relic from the first night of her marriage, a pair of untouched flutes meant for celebration. She had refused to discard them, not out of sentiment but as a reminder. One glass now held peonies fresh from Anna's garden, its bowl catching sunlight each dawn. It stood as a symbol of what had been promised but never delivered, transfigured into beauty of her own making. She no longer grieved the toast that had never been. She celebrated instead the bloom she had cultivated from ashes. Rowan drifted like a ghost through the periphery of this new world. No longer adversary, no longer partner, simply a shadow of a man watching the house he thought was his pulse with energy he could not command. Some nights, he lingered in the library, staring at books he never read. Other times, he disappeared for days, and his absence was hardly noticed. The staff treated him with polite indifference, their loyalties long since pledged elsewhere. Evelyn herself, once fierce protector of her son's legacy, had shifted entirely. Her pride, though understated, belonged to Naya now. One quiet evening, Evelyn said the words aloud as snow fell outside the drawing room windows. She told Naya that you are the matriarch of this house, not in law perhaps, but in truth. The family knows it. The staff knows it. The county knows it. She lightly touched Naya's and added, I know it. For Evelyn, admission was coronation, not with ceremony, but with honesty. Beyond the estate, the city itself bent toward her influence. Letters continued to arrive, international conferences seeking her keynote. Governments abroad asking for consultation on sustainable community models. Journalists wrote profiles not of scandal, but statesmanship, comparing her leadership philosophy to the great reformers of history. Yet through all this, Naya never allowed grandeur to obscure clarity. She declined more invitations than she accepted, ensuring that each appearance, each word spoken, served a greater vision rather than vanity. On a crisp winter morning, she stood at the edge of the frozen lake, her breath clouding the air, and considered the journey. She had been abandoned on the night when bells should have rung in celebration. She had sat alone while the world presumed her broken. Yet that silence had become forge and fire. From betrayal she had drawn strength. From humiliation she had shaped honor. From absence she had birthed presence. She whispered into the cold air, not as a vow, but as an affirmation. The crown was never his to give. It was mine to forge. The estate glowed behind her, alive with the warmth of staff preparing meals, scholars arriving for mentorship, and leaders entering for counsel. The world beyond awaited her judgment, her strategies, her light. She turned toward it, her footsteps steady against the snow. She did not carry jewels or gold. She took something far weightier: trust, respect, vision, all hammered into a crown invisible yet undeniable. It rested upon her head, not by gift but by right, not by inheritance but by resilience, not by ceremony but by choice, a crown forged, not given. And hers to wear as long as her heart continued to beat for those who had once been voiceless. The bells that had been silent on her wedding night rang now only in memory, irrelevant. For in truth, she had found a sound far greater, the rising chorus of lives lifted, because she had chosen not to break, but to build. And that sound would echo long after her footsteps faded, carrying her legacy into the dawn.